Okay, so for today's experiment, the first thing you'll do when you go into the lab is check in. You'll also be learning how to draw bond line structures. Well, you should watch the tutorial that's available on Canvas, and I'll talk about that a little bit in this video too. And you also learn how to use a melt temp to determine melting points and conduct some simple solubility tests. And the point of this is that you begin to learn how to relate physical properties such as melting points and solubilities to the structure of the organic compounds. Okay, now for bond line structures. You should be familiar with Lewis structures from general chemistry. And in the first structure here, this is hexane, and this has 6 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons, and the corresponding hydrogens drawn so that each carbon has 4 bonds as it needs to satisfy the octet rule. So for bond line structures, what you need to realize is that each end of a line and each joint in a line is a carbon compound. So for a hexane, which has 6 carbons, we'd do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's, and hydrogens are understood, and atoms such as chlorine or oxygen are drawn explicitly. So this is actually the bond line structure for hexane right here. Much simpler than a Lewis structure, which is why we use them. Okay. I'll let you do, well, no, actually, let's do dichloromethane since it's a little bit different. So we have 1 carbon, so that's just a dot. And then we need to draw the 2 chlorine atoms specifically. Okay. And we'll help you out a bit and do the ethyl acetate, and then I'll let you do ethanol by yourself. Okay, so ethyl acetate has 1, 2 carbons, and then an oxygen, and then 2 more carbons. So start with a dot for a carbon, another carbon, and then here we have an oxygen, so we draw that explicitly, and then 2 more carbons, carbon, carbon. And on the second carbon, you have a double bond with an oxygen. And there you go, that's ethyl acetate. Okay, so hopefully from this pattern and from watching the tutorial video, you can figure out ethanol for yourself. Okay, so these, I forgot to mention that these are your liquids that you're using in the experiment today. These are your solids: benzoic acid, naphthalene, 2-naphthol, and phenol. And these are all what are called aromatic compounds, which you'll learn a lot more about as you go through the course. Okay, and so for the bond line structure, carbons explicitly, we just draw them in a hexagon like this, and then draw in the double bonds. Oh, I forgot to mention earlier, each joint or end is a carbon and each line is a bond. Okay, so now we have the ring drawn. So we need to add this, it's called a substituent. And we have, oops, I forgot the carbon there. But so we draw a single carbon, that's the bond to the carbon, and then the OH group explicitly, and then the double bond to the oxygen explicitly. Okay, naphthalene is pretty simple, so I'll let you figure that out on your own. Hint, it's just 2 of these hexagons stuck together. And naphtha is also pretty easy. You just have the 2 rings stuck together and then the OH drawn. And phenol is also pretty easy, so I'll let you figure those out by yourself. If you get stuck, you can always ask your TA. Now that we've talked about bond line structures and a little bit about the structure of organic compounds in general, we can talk about melting points and predicting relative melting points. Hopefully you remember from general chemistry intermolecular forces. And if you don't, there's a tutorial on Canvas for you. But at any rate, the three types of intermolecular forces are London dispersion forces, dipole, and hydrogen bonding. Do you remember which of these is the strongest? So the strongest of the three is generally hydrogen bonds. And usually the weakest is London dispersion forces. So if you look at these two compounds, both of which you're using today, naphthalene and 2-naphthol, which of these two is capable of forming a hydrogen bond? It will be the naphthol since it's got the OH group on it. So since naphthalene, since it just has carbons and hydrogens, would just have London dispersion forces, and 2-naphthol, which has the OH group and can form hydrogen bonds, which would have the stronger intermolecular forces. Okay, so that would, since 2-naphthol can form the hydrogen bonds, this would have the stronger intermolecular forces, and therefore should be a little bit harder to melt, and therefore should have the higher melting point. Okay, something I should mention that is unique to these aromatic compounds is that there may be some surprising results, and something that may help you explain this is that aromatic compounds have this unique type of London dispersion force called stacking, where the two rings can this is an oversimplification, but can lie sort of flat and stack on top of each other, and that makes really strong London dispersion forces. And you may need this to help explain some of your results. I'm not going to say anything more now because I don't want to give it all away, but if you get confused, you can either email me or talk to one of your TAs when you're answering your analysis questions. Okay, so moving on to predicting solubility. Another thing that you should remember from general chemistry is like dissolves like. In other words, if you have a polar compound, you need a polar solvent. If you have a nonpolar compound, you need a nonpolar solvent. Okay, so let's take an example here. We have benzoic acid, which is one of the solids that you're using today. And then we have a couple of the solvents or liquids you're using today, hexane and ethanol. So if you look at benzoic acid, would you say that this is polar or nonpolar? And remember, for polar, you need to have some atoms with differences in electronegativity, like, oxygen and hydrogen, for example. So I just sort of gave it away. This would be a relatively polar compound. Okay, so which solvent would be better for it, hexanes or ethanol? If you look at hexanes, all you have is carbon and hydrogens. So would it be polar or nonpolar? Hopefully you pick nonpolar. And then ethanol, since it has the OH group here, is it polar or nonpolar? Okay, this should be relatively polar. So, since like dissolves like, if you're trying to dissolve benzoic acid, you would, since it's polar, you would pick the more polar solvent. Okay, let's see what's next. Okay, procedure. The procedure today is pretty simple. You are learning how to use a melt temp, but it's explained in detail with lots of photos in your experiment reading. And of course, your TAs are there to help you out if you're unsure about anything. A couple reminders concerning safety. Please put capillary tubes in the broken glass, not in the trash, because when the custodians or student workers empty the trash, if there's glass in there and they're unaware of it, they could get poked, and that's not a good thing. weigh boats and droppers go in the blue bucket that's by your hood, and make sure that you're putting them in there without chemicals. Chemical waste goes in the jars, the waste jars in the waste hood, and there's acetone in there to help you rinse glassware if you need it. And then finally, log out of all the applications that you logged into in your iPad, plug it in, and return the crayon to its spot. Don't forget to wash your hands before you leave. Okay, some safety for this experiment. Melt temps get hot, so be careful. Phenol is quite corrosive. If you look at this information from the SDS sheet, safety data sheet, you see it's toxic, corrosive, health hazard, environmentally damaging, but the main thing that we want you to be careful of is that it's corrosive. So just, handle it in the hood. Make sure you, of course, have gloves on. If you get any on yourself, immediately rinse with water and call your TA. Also, many organic solvents are flammable, so make sure you're keeping them away from the melt temp. They should be kept in the hood anyway, but just be especially careful. And finally, don't crank the melt temp up to full power and then walk away, because we've had the thermometers shoot out and hit the ceiling, and that's not a good thing.